5 women brutally murdered in the same neighborhood within 3 months. And the killer, he walked away every single time. No arrest, no trial, no justice, ever. But here's what makes this case different from every other unsolved murder in history. The killer wrote letters, taunting the police, taunting the press, signing them with a name he invented himself, Jack the Ripper. And 136 years later, with DNA technology, forensic science, and the most sophisticated investigative tools in human history, we still cannot say with certainty who he was, or whether he was even a he at all. 3 things in this video are going to stay with you. The suspect nobody talks about, the evidence that was destroyed before anyone understood its value, and the one detail sitting in plain sight for over a century that might finally point to the truth. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, you're in the right place. Subscribe and don't go anywhere, because this one gets dark fast. Set the scene: Whitechapel, East London, 1888. This was not a pleasant neighborhood. Overcrowded, desperately poor, filled with lodging houses where dozens of people slept packed into single rooms. The streets were narrow, dark, and largely unlit after midnight. It was the kind of place where people disappeared, and nobody asked too many questions. The Metropolitan Police were stretched thin, communication was slow, forensic science barely existed. Fingerprinting wouldn't become standard police procedure for another decade. DNA analysis was a century away. 5 women were killed between August and November of 1888, all east in Whitechapel, all within a roughly 1-mile radius, all with wounds that suggested the killer had at least some knowledge of human anatomy. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These are the 5 canonical victims, the ones almost every investigator agrees were killed by the same person. Here's the first thing that should bother you. The police had a suspect in custody within weeks. They let him go. So why did they release him? And was that the biggest mistake in the history of British law enforcement? His name was Aaron Kosminski, Polish-born barber living in Whitechapel, known to local police, described in official documents as a suspect of significant interest. One detective, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, reportedly wrote Kosminski's name directly into the margin of a confidential police report, identifying him as the man they believed responsible. The Metropolitan Police had him, but they could not convict him because the one witness who could place him at a crime scene refused to testify against a fellow Jewish man, a decision driven by community fear and distrust of the police. Without testimony, there was no case. Kosminski was eventually committed to a mental asylum in 1891, where he remained until his death in 1919. And here is where it gets complicated. In 2014, a businessman named Russell Edwards claimed to have purchased a shawl Doreo found near one of the murder scenes. He commissioned DNA testing, and according to his analysis, mitochondrial DNA on the shawl matched a descendant of Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims, and also matched a descendant of Aaron Kosminski. Case closed, Ripper identified. Not quite. Independent scientists raised serious questions about the methodology, whether the shawl was properly authenticated, whether the chain of custody was clean enough for the DNA to mean anything definite. The scientific community did not accept it as proof, which means the most famous cold case in history is still officially open. But that's not even the most frustrating part of this story. Here's the detail that haunts investigators to this day. During the investigation, the Metropolitan Police received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. Most were obvious hoaxes, written by journalists, thrill-seekers, and attention-hungry members of the public. But 3 of them stood apart: the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter, which arrived with a small cardboard box containing half a preserved human kidney. Catherine Eddowes had a kidney removed during her murder. The From Hell letter has never been definitively proven to be from the killer, but it has also never been convincingly dismissed. Now here's the part that should make you genuinely angry on behalf of every investigator who came after. The police destroyed most of the original letters and evidence in the early 1900s. routine administrative clearance. Nobody at the time understood what those documents might one day reveal. If those letters existed today, with modern handwriting analysis, ink dating, paper forensics, and DNA extraction from the envelope seals, we might actually have an answer. Instead, they're gone. But even without them, there is one suspect in this case that almost nobody discusses publicly. And the evidence around them is harder to dismiss than anything connected to Kosminski. Her name was Mary Piercy. Not a man, a woman. In October 1890, just 2 years after the Whitechapel murders, Mary Piercy murdered a woman and her infant child in North London. The crime was extraordinarily violent. The wounds were described by investigators at the time as bearing striking similarities to injuries found on Ripper victims, particularly the precision and the depth. Piercy was convicted and executed in 1890. But before she died, she placed a cryptic personal advertisement in a Madrid newspaper, MECP, last wish of MECP, bulling to hear from MECP. Nobody has ever fully explained what that message meant, or who it was for. Here's the theory that a small number of serious researchers have pursued quietly for decades. The Ripper killing showed anatomical knowledge, but they also showed something else, an ability to move through Whitechapel at night without attracting attention. A man covered in blood in those streets, in that era, would have been noticed. A woman might not have been. The victims trusted their killer enough to approach closely in a dark street. Could a woman, particularly one with a history of extreme violence and access to the same neighborhood, have operated without ever appearing on the police's radar? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Piercy was never formally investigated in connection with the Ripper killings. She died before anyone thought to connect the dots. And that's the part of this story that sits uncomfortably in the back of every serious researcher's mind. The greatest detective failure in history might not be that they couldn't catch Jack the Ripper. It might be that they were looking for the wrong kind of person entirely. So what does all of this mean 136 years later? There are 3 things this case permanently changed, and they affect criminal investigation to this day. First, it created the concept of the serial killer profile. Before Jack the Ripper, police investigated murders as individual crimes. The idea that one person could commit multiple, unconnected murders in a specific pattern, targeting a specific type of victim for psychological rather than practical reasons. That framework barely existed in 1888. The Ripper case forced investigators to think differently, to look for patterns, to consider motive beyond money, jealousy, or revenge. That shift in thinking eventually became the foundation of modern criminal profiling. The same methodology used by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, which has since helped solve thousands of cases worldwide. Second, it exposed the fatal cost of destroyed evidence. Every major cold case investigation since 1888 has had to grapple with the same question. What was lost before anyone understood its value? The Ripper case became the defining example of why evidence preservation matters, not just for today's technology, but for technology that doesn't exist yet. Modern cold case units now operate on the assumption that evidence collected today may not yield answers for 20 or 30 years. When the science finally catches up, the Ripper case taught them that lesson the hardest possible way. Third, and this one is personal, the 5 women killed in Whitechapel were not famous. They were poor, struggling, and largely invisible to the society around them. For decades, historical coverage of this case focused almost entirely on the killer, his identity, his methods, his letters. While the victims were reduced to crime scene data, recent researchers have pushed back hard on that. Books, documentaries, and academic studies have worked to restore the full lives of Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, their families, their histories, their humanity. Because the real story of Jack the Ripper was never about him. It was always about them. Before we wrap up, there's one final thing you need to know. Here's the detail that reframes everything. In 2019, writer Hallie Rubenhold published a book called The Five, a forensic reconstruction of the lives of the canonical Ripper victims based on historical records, census data, and contemporary accounts. What she found dismantled one of the longest-standing assumptions about this case. For 130 years, popular history had described most of the victims as prostitutes, a characterization used, consciously or not, to explain why they were vulnerable, why they were alone at night, why they were targeted. Rubenhold found that the historical evidence for this characterization was, in most cases, thin or non-existent. Several of the women showed no evidence of sex work in any documented record. They were homeless, struggling, sleeping rough on the streets of one of the most overcrowded cities in the world because they had nowhere else to go. They were not targeted because of what they did. They were targeted because of how invisible they were. And that invisibility, the same thing that made them vulnerable in 1888, also shaped how history remembered them for over a century. The killer was never caught, but the women he killed deserved better than the story they were given. That's the real unsolved mystery of this case. Not who he was, but why it took 130 years for anyone to ask who they were. If this story made you think differently about what we call history, you're not alone. Let's bring it together. A killer operated in Whitechapel for 3 months in 1888. 5 women died. The police had a suspect and couldn't convict him. Key evidence was destroyed before its value was understood. A female suspect was never seriously investigated, and for over a century, the victims themselves were defined almost entirely by how they died, rather than how they lived. The case is officially still open. If this is the kind of deep, forgotten history you want more of, subscribe right now. Every week, we go into the cases, the discoveries, and the stories that most people have never heard the full version of. Check the pinned comment. I've left something there that most Ripper documentaries completely ignore. It changes how you see this case. And here's your question for the comments. After everything in this video, who do you think Jack the Ripper was? Kosminski? Mary Piercy? Someone else entirely? Drop your theory below. Some of the best answers on this channel come from the comments. And on a case this old, a fresh perspective might be worth more than you think. The next video covers the cold case that modern DNA finally cracked after 40 years. That one has an answer, and it's not who anyone expected.